Defending Israel with facts and logic. The civilian casualty double standard. Proposition: Israel is held to a much higher standard in terms of its obligation to avoid civilian casualties than any other civilization in history. Before we proceed, it's important to note at the outset that any number of civilian casualties is bad. If even one non-combatant civilian casualty can be avoided, it should. And it ought to be a moral obligation of all nations. The American Civil War general, Robert E. Lee, wrote, "It is well war is so terrible, lest we grow fond of it." Part of why war is so terrible is that the innocent often suffer. Albert Einstein wrote, "War may sometimes be a necessary evil. But no matter how necessary, it is always an evil." Israel's war against Hamas is without doubt morally justified, for much greater instability and suffering for everyone in the region would arise if Hamas, a murderous terrorist extension of Iran, were allowed to persist. And Hamas leadership has said bluntly on television that it intends to continue the mass murder of any non-Muslim neighbors, identical to that of the October 7th butchery of innocent civilians. Hamas must be destroyed. But, as warfare is necessary to achieve this aim, innocents will certainly suffer and perish in that process, and that is, as Albert Einstein wrote, an evil. None of this, so far, is controversial. However, I have observed in the popular media and from the far-left progressives, a deep double standard. A double standard that runs so deep, many on the progressive left aren't even aware they hold it. Specifically, the popular media and the far left seems to turn a blind eye to conflicts elsewhere in the world and conflicts in other times in world history, where civilian casualties were significant. While inexplicably, Israel is subjected to a magnifying glass of intense scrutiny that, I argue, no other country in human history has had to endure, particularly in the midst of a struggle for the survival of its people, its nation, and its future. But as I have previously stated, Hamas presents just such a struggle. No nation can permit barbarians whose only purpose is mass murder, to plot such murders right on its borders. So, as far as civilian casualties are concerned, we know that Israel takes extraordinary measures that no other country in history has ever done, in order to minimize civilian casualties. Israel has dropped millions of flyers in Gaza warning the locals to evacuate. They use so-called knock-on bombs that hit the roofs of buildings without exploding, to warn residents to evacuate. They send emails, texts, phone calls and other means of communication prior to an attack. Now let's look at some other conflicts in history as a comparator. In World War II, German civilians killed only by Allied strategic bombing are thought to have ranged from between 350,000 to 500,000 innocent civilians killed. Who was telling the Allies to cease our fire? Who was protesting those killed at the time? Which neutral power was slamming the US and UK in the international news daily for killing innocent Germans? Spain? Argentina? Of course not. Now, what about Japan in World War II? The civilian death toll in Japan from Allied bombing was between 330,000 and 900,000, with an additional 112,000 killed from the atomic bombs. Japan suffered nearly 1 million civilian deaths from bombings. Where were the protests against the use of excessive force by the Allies? There were none, at least that I'm aware of. Moving to the present day. What about the ongoing civil war in Syria? The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs estimates that in Syria, a country where 90% of the population is Muslim, that at least 230,000 civilians have died, over 15,000 have been tortured, and nearly 14 million Syrians have been displaced in Muslim-on-Muslim violence. But the number of killed is probably much higher, closer to 500,000. Where are the street protests against Bashar al-Assad? Was there even one, single, politically left progressive who waved a flag of the Syrian opposition, who marched in a single street, who wrote a single essay in the popular media? The media has forgotten about the 500,000 innocent Muslims killed by other Muslims in a country right next door to Israel. Why? Could it be because the Syrians don't want the world to know about Muslim-on-Muslim violence? Could it be because the Iranians don't want the world to remember about Muslim-on-Muslim violence that has displaced 14 million people and killed nearly 500,000? Now let's look at another conflict with civilian casualties, the conflict in Yemen. Where is Yemen, you might ask? Yemen borders Saudi Arabia on the south. It's about 1,500 miles south of Israel. Quoting the website, Campaign Against Arms Trade, in the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, nearly 15,000 civilians have been killed by direct military action, most of them in airstrikes by the Saudi-led coalition. Air raids have frequently targeted civilian gatherings such as weddings and busy marketplaces where there was no military target nearby, often with extremely deadly consequences. While there has been some spattering of media coverage related to this, it has also been swept under the rug of our attention. Where's the wall-to-wall outrage and coverage of 15,000 civilian deaths in the Yemen versus Saudi conflict? Incidentally, this is another Shiite versus Sunni conflict and another example of Muslim-on-Muslim butchery in our modern world. But alas, I haven't seen any massive street protests backing the Houthi rebels' right to self-determination in Yemen. The Houthis are cut from the same cloth as Hamas, they are Shiite rebels, backed by Iran. So shouldn't we see mass protests against Saudi Arabia and mass protests against Syria in the streets? Tens to hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths have been occurring and virtually no one on college campuses seemed to care. The far-left students only cared once Israel defended itself. Still not persuaded there's a double standard? I'll give you one more. Ukraine. According to the United Nations website, Russia has killed nearly 10,000 Ukrainian civilians with another 20,000 wounded. The news service, Reuters, has documented the intentional bombing of civilians in Ukraine by Russia. Let's take a quick look. October 5, 2023. A Russian missile slammed into a cafe and grocery store in the northeastern village of Rosa, killing at least 51 people as they held a memorial service, Ukrainian officials said. September 6, 2023. At least 16 people were killed in an explosion at a busy market in the eastern Ukrainian city of Kostyantynivka. June 27, 2023. A Russian missile hit a pizza restaurant in the eastern city of Kramatorsk, killing 13 people. April 28, 2023. At least 23 civilians were killed, including 6 children, when a high-rise apartment block was hit by a Russian missile in the central town of Uman. Where are the protests of Vladimir Putin and Russia, on college campuses? Where is the outrage among the young far-left progressive women at universities? Where are the days of rage against Vladimir Putin's intentional targeting of pizza restaurants? Where were the legitimate military targets? This is just a quick look at the intense double standard levied against the world's only Jewish state. Massive outrage and street protests, spikes in anti-Semitism when Israel is in a conflict for its survival, a democratic country that holds many of the same values as the United States and the West. But tens to hundreds of thousands bombed and tortured in Syria by a Muslim government, bombed in Yemen by a Muslim government, bombed in Ukraine by Putin, and the world stays mostly silent. The reasons why are worthy of another video. It has to do with the 48-year-long campaign to discredit Israel, started by Communist Russia in 1975 with United Nations General Assembly Resolution 3379, in which it equated Zionism with racism. The resolution was later revoked, but it seeded a 48-year-long campaign, picked up by the fundamentalist ultra-religious Iranian regime, to discredit and demean, and make life for Israel as difficult as possible. The far-left progressive youth has learned these lies and learned to parrot the double standard that Russia and Iran have created and nurtured and exaggerated and compelled the world to believe. But don't you believe it? Just next time when you storm out onto the street demanding that Israel be careful with every move it makes, ask yourself, did you also storm out into the street to demand the Syrian government be less brutal against the 500,000 mostly Muslim people it killed? Did you also storm into a college campus rally demanding that Vladimir Putin be brought to justice for his 10,000 bombings at cafes and apartments in Ukraine? Did you protest in front of the White House, demanding justice for the Shiite Muslim Houthis, who are being slaughtered at public gatherings and weddings by Saudi Arabia? Did you do these things? No, you did not. And the reason you didn't is because you have been trained by Russia and Iran to only focus a microscope on Israel, a tiny democracy trying to make a peaceful home in a land surrounded by feuding Muslim countries. You've been trained, and you don't even know it.